Hello and welcome to another video in Zenatta Consulting's Zoho tutorial series. My name is Tyler Colt, and in this video, we're going to be walking through a couple key features within Zoho Analytics. So we're going to be covering formula fields, or formula columns, I should say, aggregate formulas, and then some very basic kind of intro level SQL that will help you kind of jumpstart your usage of Zoho Analytics. If you do find this video useful, be sure to like and subscribe down below. That really does help us out, and it'll make sure that you don't miss our future videos as we continue to put them out. If you do have any questions or comments as well, please do leave us a comment down below. Let us know how we can make our videos better, or if there's any topics that you'd like us to cover. We, of course, love to get that feedback from you guys. So in this video, we're going to cover three key kind of formulas or customizations that you can do within Zoho Analytics. So the first one is going to be a formula column. The next will be an aggregate formula. And then lastly, we'll do a simple example of a SQL table that you might put together to do some custom reporting. So with that, let's jump right in and we'll dive into the formula column first. So here what I've done is I've pulled up the data table for leads. As you'll see, we've got our sample data in here. They've got all the standard stuff you would expect to see: the name, the company, the contact information. We also have some data like when the lead was created and when it was converted, if of course it's been converted at this point. But let's imagine that we wanted to take some type of metric and understand that, for each salesperson, how long does it take them to convert a lead, right? And so if we look at this data, we have the start and we have the end, but we don't really have an actual number of how many days it took between that creation time and that converted time. So this would be a perfect use case to use a formula column, because with a formula column, we're basically going to add a column that's going to run some type of calculation on each and every single row individually. So to actually create a formula column, we'll come up to the top left here and click on Add, and then we'll click on the formula column here. That's going to pull out a little tab on the right-hand side. Let's give this a name. So we'll call it Days to Convert. And so now we kind of have these two tabs on the right-hand side here. We have columns, which are the data that are in this table. And then we have functions, which are what we can do with this data. So we'll see kind of as a quick run through, they have these functions organized into a variety of different categories. So things like getting what day of the week a certain date value is, getting what month it is. You have things like date arithmetic, where you're saying add a certain number of days, add a certain number of months, or subtract a certain number of those same values. You have, of course, kind of your standard conversions with dates. Business dates, if you wanted to add business days in particular, you could do that with a separate function. Lastly, these functions are not just specific to date values. So you'll see that it has a whole rounding out of kind of numerical functions. Here, we don't find ourselves using these too much, but it has even things like getting the sign value for a numerical column, assigning a ceiling to certain values. You also have the ability to create string formula columns. So a common one would be maybe you have a column that has full names in it. And so you might want to do a substring before a space to get their first name, and then a substring after a space to get their last name, right? So you can kind of actually adjust even text columns using a formula. Additionally, they do have a full suite of logical formulas as well. So I could say, if the lead is a certain type, then do this, otherwise do this other action. And so you'll see there's kind of a whole huge bank of functions that you can use. For the developers in the room, you'll see most of these are very similar or identical to SQL functions that you would apply in a standard SQL script. So if you're comfortable there, you're very likely going to be comfortable here as well. So to do our first little function that we want to create, it's going to be a pretty simple one. So what we'll do is, I'm just going to jump back to all here, and I'll do a search, and I'm cheating because I already know what we're going to use. But here we're going to use this days between. And so the nice thing here inside of analytics is that when you are creating these formula columns, it actually gives you all of the kind of reference information you need to set it up correctly. So if we look at our little pop out here, it's basically saying that the days between function is going to return the count of days between two given dates. We'll see the structure of it there, that we're going to have days between, and then a parentheses, and then our start date, comma, end date, and it will calculate the number of days between those. So I'm going to go ahead and click on days between. And so now that we've defined our first function that we're going to use, we need to tell it what to run this formula on. And so I've flipped back over to columns here, and I'll add in, we're going to start at our created time. And if I left this empty, it would go created time to the current date, but that's not really what we want here. What we want to see is the difference between the created time and the converted time. So I'll drop that in as our second parameter. So now I'll go ahead and click save. Sometimes that's going to have to think for a second as it runs it. If you do have a really big data set, that load is going to take a little bit longer. Just let it do its thing. It's basically computing and applying the formula to all existing columns or all existing rows in that data table. But so now over here on the right, we'll see that for these first three leads, they don't have a value in days to convert because they're not yet converted. And that's actually a good thing. We don't want this to show 0, because if we took an average, that would actually lower our average for leads that haven't been converted yet. And then we'll see that for these 3 leads that were converted, they did happen to be converted on the same day, but we'll see that it's calculated the 128 days between the creation and the conversion of that lead. And so, as you'd imagine, there's a ton of different use cases for these. Everything from, substringing values, or, oftentimes you might say that, you might roll up certain values like lead source. So if we use that as an example, maybe I have these varieties of lead sources, and maybe I want to group them into outbound or inbound, right? So I've got these, maybe 5 different options here, and I want to create a new kind of overarching umbrella lead source. I could come in and add another formula, and I could say something like outbound versus inbound. Here, I'm going to use an example of a logical function. This one's actually one of my favorites here. It's called an if case. So in this case, maybe I'll say kind of create a multi-if statement all in one. So I'll say if the lead source is advertisement, make sure we spell that right here. We'll call that inbound. If it was cold call, we'll call that outbound, right? You can kind of see so on and so forth. We might group these all up into the various values that we need. If it was an online store, that's going to be an inbound type of lead. If it was a web download, that would be an inbound as well. And so you can kind of see that you can start to do both operations that have to do with math, as well as things that have to do with kind of like text values and roll-ups and so on and so forth. So I'll go ahead and finish this out real quickly here. A cold call would be a outbound. And then lastly here, we'll say that an employee referral, we'll call that an outbound as well. Right, so I basically created an if statement. If lead source is this, then show this. If lead source is cold call, then show outbound, right? And so of course, with any of these functions, you'll get more comfortable with them over time. But the trick is to just use these little pop outs and info statements, because they're really going to give you just about everything you need to set these up. So I'll go ahead and save that now. And then we'll take a look at what this looks like. And so we'll see that now it's added this new column that's basically taking, based on these lead sources, how would we group them at like a top-down level, right? And how would we actually take these and maybe roll them up into a larger grouping than what we had before. And so that kind of wraps up what we'd want to go through here for the formula columns. So let's now jump into the aggregate formulas. So aggregate formulas are a little bit different than the formula columns because they're designed to run on more than one row at a time. So when I add a formula column, it's basically going to run it for every single row in this table. But what we'll see is that when I create an aggregate formula, it's not going to actually add a column. They're really only going to be available in reports, which I will go ahead and show once we kind of wrap up the creation of that aggregate formula. So let's go ahead and think about how we might want to do some roll-ups on this data. So let's say we wanted to look at something like the count of leads based on, maybe our lead source or lead status, or, maybe we wanted to look at something like the sum of annual revenue in the pipeline versus our outbound or inbound identifier. And then maybe we want to do something, maybe even more specific, like let's get a count of converted leads, right? Outside of just maybe a count of total leads by source. Maybe we'd want to get a count of the converted leads also by source. So let's jump in and we'll do that one first here. So what I'll do is I'll come in and I'll click add and I'll go to an aggregate formula here again. And so we'll see that there's actually now kind of this new tab in here that wasn't available when we did a formula column, and it's an aggregate column here. And so let's say I wanted to do something like our converted lead count. So in here, what I can actually do is if I scroll through here, you have kind of some brute force ones, like just give me a total sum. Then you also have ones like count if or sum if. And so in this case, we'll use this count if, and I'll say we want to count the lead if this is converted equals yes. And so I'm basically saying, however I want to report on this, whether I'm grouping it up in a pivot table based on lead source, based on the lead owner, however I'm doing my pivot, if I use this value, I want it to show only the ones that have been converted in those sources. So I'll go ahead and save. Maybe I've done this in the past here. Make it a V2. And the difference here, what we'll see is that it's not actually showing as a column because it's not its own column. It's basically, we've taught it this formula that it's going to run when we tell it to, and it's going to display it based on the context of when we're asking it to run. So let's kind of put this all together a little bit on a pivot table. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new pivot view, and I'll make this based on leads. If you haven't seen kind of creation of pivots before, we actually did do a full webinar on Zoho Analytics that would be worth checking out. In that video, I kind of break down exactly how to go in here and create reports, create charts, pivots, summaries, you name it. For now, we're going to kind of assume that we're comfortable with the pivots here and that we're ready to kind of create a table. So I'll go ahead and create a new pivot table. It's going to look at the lead data that we've kind of created here. And now let's say that the primary thing that I want to evaluate is the effectiveness of different marketing sources and the quality of the leads that are coming through those sources. So I'll start creating a pivot. Maybe I want to group it by inbound versus outbound first. And then maybe I want to see the lead sources within that. So I'll add that as well. And so now we've seen we kind of have the beginnings of a pivot table here. And now maybe I want to say, let's use this days to convert, right? This formula column that we just created. And we'll see that for my advertisement and web download, both of these lead sources did actually have a converted lead, whereas the online store did not, right? So this is going to show as empty. Now, what we might notice is that right now, this is looking at a sum of my days to convert. That's not really what we would look at here. We'd probably look at something more like an average. In this case, because we only have one of each, these numbers aren't going to change, but the totals will. So now rather than this kind of row total showing a sum, it'll show an average, which I think is kind of a better way to look at this data. But lastly here, we'll notice that while the converted lead count does not exist on our leads table, it does in fact exist in our pivot view, because it's able to be calculated once we add it to a report, right? So I'll go ahead and grab our converted lead count and I'll drag that in. And now we'll see it kind of lines up here. We have one lead converted from cold call, and this was the amount of days it took. We have one from advertisement, one from web download. We'll see though here, we've converted 2 in total under this kind of master grouping of inbound. And so what you start to see is that, with analytics, it's a very powerful tool, but it might not give you every single number and value that you're looking for. Oftentimes it will be super useful to be able to use these formulas and aggregate formulas to be able to kind of slice and dice your data or do some of these roll-ups that kind of don't come out of the box. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and save this here just as a demo pivot table. And then we'll move on to the kind of last element here that we want to cover, which is the ability to actually pull SQL tables within Zoho Analytics. So this part is going to be a little bit more developer focused. We're not going to do anything crazy, but it will show some actual SQL code and kind of how we go about creating it. So let's say that we are looking to do some reporting about accounts and the related deals to those accounts. So I'm going to pull up those data tables. And what we'll notice is that the accounts table doesn't store any of the deal data, and our deal data doesn't really store anything about the account other than this ID. And so what we'll find is that if I grab this ID here for my deal and I search it over inside of my account, I'll find a match, right? Based on this ID column here. So 8101, 8101, great. We've got these things pretty much lined up how we need them. And so in a lot of cases, you can kind of pull reports just based on one data source or based on, kind of a collage of tables inside of a pivot view. But sometimes you might want to do a little bit of custom data management. And so to do that, you can pull up a query table under a little create tab and kind of build your own table on the fly. So essentially what we're going to be doing here is creating our own kind of column names and column, data definitions, just using a little piece of code. So here, I'm going to do this in a very simple way. We're not going to go too heavy and too deep on this. There's infinite things that you can do here. We're just going to go with the basics. So essentially here, what I'm doing is I'm running a select. So this is just our SQL notation to say the following are going to be the columns of the table that are going to come out of this. And so I'll go ahead and select maybe account name from our accounts. And I'll call that account name. And then maybe I want a table of account names and all of the deals that each of those accounts have. So now I'll go ahead here and grab a deal name. These little as account name and as deal names are just defining the columns that we want it to actually be called once we're done. I'll give this a name of accounts and deals. And so now, of course, I could bring really any data from accounts and any data from deals. If I wanted the account owner or if I wanted the deal owner, the deal amount, really any of those things are all fair game here. In this case, we'll keep it simple and we'll move on to part 2 of the SQL code, which is our from statement. So here I've defined what I want my columns to be. And next I'm going to tell it where to get that data from explicitly. And so here I'm going to get this from accounts, but not just accounts. I'm going to join accounts against deals. And so I'm basically saying, take a row from my accounts table and line it up with a row from my deals table and have my new table show that row that's kind of been connected. And the reason that I started by showing this account name and the fact that it's here in the deal as well as here in the account is that that ID is what we'll use to join on. So our structure is select these columns from my parent table, join my child table on a certain matching parameter. And so here I'll say we're going to do our join wherever the account ID matches, or the account ID in the account matches the account ID from the deal. I'll go ahead and now save that. And now if we take a look at this table here, we'll see that we basically have a deal lined up now with any of our various accounts. And we're able to not actually have to go to the accounts table to see the account name. So we essentially kind of swapped out this ID with the actual name of that account. Now, this is like a very kind of entry-level example of a SQL table. There's a lot more you can do with these. You can run sums and groupings and averages and really almost anything that you can think of in a SQL table. But the core idea here is just that you can create your own data table that is pulling values from a variety of different tables, as long as you have something to line them up. So you could always join, you can join data from QuickBooks against data from Zoho Books in here, lining things up on the company name, right? You could join your Sales IQ visitors against CRM leads based on an email address, right? So it's just a very robust tool to start blending together data and create the structure that you need to actually derive the reports that you're looking for. Again, I really do hope that this video was useful here, kind of covering our formula fields, aggregate formulas, and then last but not least, these SQL tables. Again, if you did find this video useful, please be sure to like and subscribe down below so that our future videos make it onto your list. If there's any topics that you want us to cover in particular, or if this video kind of sparked any questions for you, please do leave us a comment down below, and we'll either respond to you there or on our weekly podcast, the CRM Zen Show. Thanks again for watching.